There's a pattern in Scripture that doesn't make sense at first glance. The moments when people need God most desperately, when they're crying out for help, begging for answers, desperate for intervention, are often the moments when God seems most silent. Moses spends 40 years in the wilderness before the burning bush. The Israelites suffer 400 years in Egypt before deliverance. Job loses everything and gets chapters of questions instead of explanations. Jesus himself cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and hears nothing. This pattern repeats through Scripture and through history and through your life. The crisis hits. You pray, you beg, you plead. And the response is silence that feels like absence, quiet that feels like abandonment, a lack of answers that feels like lack of care. If you've ever been in that place, if you've ever felt like God went silent exactly when you needed to hear from Him most, you've probably asked the same questions everyone asks. Did I do something wrong? Is God punishing my lack of faith? Does He not care about this crisis? Has He moved on to someone else's problems? Am I praying wrong, believing wrong, living wrong? And underneath all those questions is the deeper, more terrifying one. Is anyone actually listening? But here's what we miss when we interpret silence as absence. We're measuring God's presence by human standards. We're assuming that care requires constant communication, that love demands immediate response, that if someone truly cares, they'll answer quickly and clearly. We've made an equation. Response equals care. Silence equals indifference. But what if that equation is wrong? What if God's silence doesn't mean what we think it means? What if the moments when God feels most distant are actually the moments when He's closest? What if His silence in your crisis isn't absence at all, but a different kind of presence, one we haven't learned to recognize because we're so focused on demanding that He speak? There's a Hebrew word that unlocks this, a concept woven through Scripture that most people miss because we're listening for the wrong thing. And when you understand it, God's silence stops looking like abandonment and starts looking like something else entirely. Something that might change not just how you pray, but how you understand the nature of God Himself. Let me tell you about Claire. She sat alone in a hospital chapel at 2 a.m., hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. Her daughter Emma had been in ICU for 6 days following a car accident. 6 days of surgeries and complications, and doctors using words like uncertain and critical. Claire had been praying constantly, not just quick prayers but desperate ones, begging God for a sign, for a promise, for anything that would tell her Emma would be okay. And for 6 days, she'd heard nothing. The silence felt like an answer, and the answer felt like no. On day 7, a hospital chaplain named Ruth found her in that chapel. Ruth didn't offer platitudes. She just sat down in the quiet. Shakat is active stillness, intentional quiet. God choosing not to fill the space with words because He's filling it with Himself. Here's what Claire realized in that moment. She'd been so focused on hearing God's voice, on getting answers, explanations, promises about Emma's future, that she'd completely missed what God was actually offering. Not information about outcomes, not certainty about the future, not a plan she could understand and control. Just presence, constant, steady, settled. So close that words would actually be less intimate than the quiet. Think about how this works in human relationships. When someone you love is in deep pain, you don't give speeches. You don't explain why suffering happens or offer 5-point plans for recovery. You sit with them. You stay. Your presence communicates what words can't. You're not alone. I'm here. I'm not leaving. God does the same thing. When the crisis hits and you're desperate for Him to speak, He often chooses Shakhat because His presence is more valuable than His explanations. He settles in, moves close, gets comfortable, and stays. Not speaking because His staying is supposed to be the message. God's silence in crisis doesn't mean He's withdrawn. It means He's settled in, closer than He's ever been. Not explaining because some things can't be explained. They can only be endured with someone who refuses to let you endure them alone. Claire didn't get the sign she was begging for. Emma's recovery was long and uncertain, but Claire learned something in that chapel that changed everything. God hadn't been absent during those 6 days. He'd been present in a way so intimate that words would have created distance, not closeness. He'd settled in, Shakhat, and He wasn't going anywhere. Now let's look at why God might choose this kind of silence, this settled presence without words. Because there's a pattern in Scripture that reveals something profound about how God communicates when it matters most. Consider Elijah. He's running from Jezebel, terrified, exhausted, suicidal. He's just won a massive victory on Mount Carmel. Fire from heaven, prophets of Baal destroyed, and now one threat from the queen has him running for his life. He prays for God to take his life. He's done. God sends an angel to feed him, then tells him to go stand on a mountain because God is about to pass by. And Elijah expects what he's seen before, displays of divine power that leave no doubt God is present. A wind comes, so strong it tears mountains apart. But the text says something shocking. The Lord was not in the wind. Then an earthquake. Surely God is in the earthquake. But again, the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then fire. Fire is God's signature move. But once more, the Lord was not in the fire. After all the noise, all the displays of power, there comes a sound of sheer silence. Some translations say a gentle whisper, and that's where God is. Not in the spectacle, in the silence. The silence wasn't God being absent. It was God being so close that quietness was enough. Now look at Jesus in the boat. A storm hits. The disciples are terrified, certain they're drowning. They wake Jesus, who's somehow sleeping through the chaos. Don't you care that we're perishing? Jesus wakes up, calms the storm with a word, then asks, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The question confuses them, but here's what Jesus was teaching. My presence in the boat with you should have been enough. The fact that I was sleeping wasn't indifference. It was profound trust that my presence, even silent presence, was all you needed. You wanted me to speak, to act. I was showing you that I am here. That's the point. His presence is the point, not his intervention. The disciples wanted Jesus to do something. Jesus was teaching them to recognize that he was already doing the most important thing, staying with them in the storm, and then there's the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus cries out, and heaven is silent. No voice from the Father, no angel sent to intervene, no dramatic rescue. Just silence. But that silence wasn't absence. The Father hadn't abandoned the Son. The Father was present in the silence, bearing with Jesus what could only be borne together, enduring what required presence without words, because words would have created distance from the experience they were sharing. This is the deepest communication possible. Suffering held together in silence so complete that even speaking would disrupt the intimacy of shared experience. God's silence in your crisis doesn't mean He's not listening. It means He's listening so intently, so completely, that He doesn't need to speak. He's already there, already holding the moment, already bearing it with you. And here's the permission hidden in this. You don't need constant verbal reassurance to know God is present. You don't need signs and wonders and answered prayers to confirm He cares. His staying is the confirmation. His settling in, shakat, is the proof. The silence isn't empty. It's full of a presence that doesn't need words because the proximity itself is the message. 9 months after Emma's accident, Claire met Nathan at a grief support group. His wife had died 6 months earlier. Cancer. 2 years of prayers that seemed to bounce off the ceiling, and he was done with God. Here's what's fascinating. Neuroscience is starting to understand what Scripture has always known. There's something called social presence, the phenomenon where being physically near someone you're bonded to actually changes your nervous system. Your heart rate regulates, your stress hormones decrease, your brain processes pain differently. Just proximity, no words required, creates measurable physiological changes. Presence itself is therapeutic, and this is how God designed us. We're wired to be affected by presence, not just by communication. God staying with you in your crisis does something to you that explanations never could. His settled presence, shakat, creates changes in you that words would actually interrupt. We live in a culture that measures care by communication. If someone cares, they text back immediately. They respond. They explain. Silence means they've forgotten you. They're busy with something more important. They don't care enough. We bring that same assumption to God. We measure His care by how quickly He responds. We interpret silence as lack of love. But what if God's care works differently? What if there are things He can only do for you in the silence? What if there's a kind of trust that only develops when you stop needing constant verbal reassurance and learn to rest in unseen presence? Claire learned this in the ICU. Emma survived, yes. But that's not actually the point of the story. The point is what formed in Claire during those days when God wouldn't speak, a trust that didn't depend on outcomes, a faith that didn't require constant reassurance, a relationship with God that could sit in silence without interpreting that silence as rejection. That trust became the foundation of everything else. It's what allowed Claire to help Nathan. It's what sustained her through Emma's long recovery. It's what changed not just her crisis, but her entire relationship with God. Nathan struggled with this for months, but slowly, imperceptibly at first, he started to sense it. That presence Claire talked about, not hearing God's voice, but feeling less alone in the quiet, sensing someone sitting with him in the grief who wasn't trying to fix it or explain it or rush him through it. "Is this what you meant?" he asked Claire 6 months later. "This feeling that someone's here even when nothing's changing?" "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what I meant. That's shakat. God settled in, and He's not leaving." So why does God feel silent when you need Him most? Not because He's absent, not because He doesn't care, not because you've done something wrong that made Him withdraw, but because in crisis, He knows you don't need information. You need presence, and presence doesn't require words. In fact, words might actually create distance from what you most need. The experience of someone staying with you in the darkness without trying to explain the darkness away. God's silence in your darkest moments isn't punishment. It's proximity. He's not far away speaking loudly. He's so close that whispers are enough. So near that His presence is supposed to be the message. This reveals something profound about God's character. He is not the distant CEO who only communicates through official statements. He is the Father who pulls up a chair next to you in the ICU, in the grief, in the 3 a.m. anxiety, and doesn't leave even when you're begging Him to explain what's happening. He's the God who values your experience of His staying more than your understanding of His plans, who cares more about being with you than about defending Himself to you, who trusts that if you'll stay in the silence long enough, you'll discover what words could never communicate. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. My presence is the point. Think about what this means. The same God who spoke galaxies into existence with words chooses silence with you, not because He lacks power to speak, but because silence is the more powerful communication in this moment. He could explain, He could promise, He could give you the assurance you're begging for, but He knows that what you actually need is deeper than information. You need the experience of not being alone, and that requires presence, not explanation. This is why Jesus didn't explain the storm to His disciples, why God didn't explain Job's suffering, why the Father didn't intervene at the cross, because some experiences can only be endured, not explained. And endurance requires presence without words. Here's what this means for you right now. If you're in a season where God feels silent, where you're crying out and hearing nothing, where every prayer seems to hit the ceiling and fall back down, God hasn't left. God isn't punishing your doubt. God isn't proving a point about your faith. God is present in the silence. Settled in, shakat. Closer than He's ever been. Not explaining because His staying is the explanation. Not speaking because His proximity is more valuable than His words. And when you finally stop demanding that He speak and just notice that He stayed, you'll realize the silence was never empty. It was full. Full of a presence that doesn't need words. Full of a God who loves you enough to sit with you in the dark without rushing to turn on the lights. That's not absence. That's the deepest kind of presence there is. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up and the first thought is the crisis you've been praying about, the thing God hasn't answered, the situation that hasn't changed, the silence that feels like abandonment, try something. Before you start begging for a sign, before you launch into another desperate prayer for answers, just pause and acknowledge you're here. In this silence, in this uncertainty, in this moment I don't understand, you're here. Not because you suddenly feel His presence, but because you're learning to trust His character over your feelings, because you're choosing to believe that His silence is shakat, settled presence, not absence. This week, practice sitting in the quiet with God, not filling the silence with more words, more requests, more demands for explanation. Just sitting. Letting the silence be what it actually is, not emptiness, but fullness. Not distance, but the deepest kind of proximity. If you're angry about the silence, if you feel abandoned and forgotten, tell Him that. But then stay. Don't leave. Don't disconnect. Stay in the quiet with the God who's staying in the quiet with you. Because here's what you'll discover if you give it time. The silence isn't rejection. It's not punishment. It's not indifference. It's God being so close that words would create distance. It's God trusting you enough to experience His presence without needing constant verbal reassurance. It's God forming something in you that can only form in the stillness. A trust that doesn't depend on understanding. A faith that doesn't require explanations. A relationship that can endure silence without interpreting it as abandonment. Next time, we'll explore what happens when God does finally speak after long silence, and why His first words are almost never the explanations we wanted. But for now, in your silence, remember, God is not far away refusing to speak. He's so near that His presence is supposed to be enough. He's settled in, shakat. He's pulled up a chair. He's not going anywhere. The silence isn't God withdrawing. It's God moving closer than words can express, closer than explanations can reach. Close enough that if you stop demanding He speak and just pay attention, you'll sense what He's been saying all along. I'm here. I'm staying. My presence is the point. You don't need to hear my voice to know I haven't left. Just notice. I'm closer than your next breath, and I'm not going anywhere. That's Shakat. That's God's silence. Not empty, not absent, not cold. Full, present, settled in for as long as it takes. And He's there right now, in your silence, waiting for you to notice He never left.